And before we get started, I'd just like to ask you to share in the chat in a few words, your name, your organization, and what brings you here today. And for those of you who have been in our previous webinars, please take the time to share something different than what you've shared before. Oh, you've got our first response there. Good morning, Noel. So again, for those of you who are coming into this session today, thank you, Susie. Those of you who are joining us, please state your name and your organization. And in a few words, what brings you here today? And great to hear that Susie is also a founding member of the new California Mountain Biking Coalition. Great to hear. Glad to have you here. And Sierra, who is looking forward to learning more about bias and is with the Great Peninsula Conservancy. Hi, Samantha from California State Parks Foundation. Great to have you here to continue learning about outdoor equity. Oh, now we've got a whole suite of you that are putting in your responses. April from Los Angeles. Nice. Daniel Cook. Blanca, Belen, Ben, Kendra. I can barely read them all. They're rushing down the chat section. So take time amongst yourselves to check out where people are from and what they're hoping to get out of this session today. Definitely a theme of welcoming, belonging, promoting inclusion of diverse groups of people in the outdoors, and engagement around outdoor equity, creating better systems for all in the outdoors. Thank you so much. Hi, Sunny. Haven't seen you in a while. Great to have you here today. Well, thank you so much, all of you who have joined so far. And as you'll see in the chat, please put your name and your organization and share why you're here today. And if you've been in these sessions previously, share something different. And those of you who are waiting for the session to start, go ahead and read what you're seeing in the chat. It's great. A lot of the comments really speak to what we're going to be covering today in terms of making these wild and open spaces that we cherish in our outdoors more inclusive and equitable. And so with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Emily Young, and I'm the executive director of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego. And I'm excited to welcome you here today to the third webinar of our 6-part series, Leaders for Outdoor Equity. And this session will focus on systemic challenges in outdoor access and land management, looking in particular at physical and functional barriers. And if you didn't have the chance to join us for the first 2 webinars, Michelle Robidas is going to put the link in the chat for you. You can access those. They are on YouTube. And we have had such an amazing group of inspiring speakers so far. So please don't miss them. They're really wonderful. The Nonprofit Institute has partnered with Outdoor Outreach, the Outdoor Foundation, Thrive Outside San Diego, the San Diego Foundation, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to put this series on for you. And the purpose of the Leaders for Outdoor Equity series is to give land managers and recreational leaders from public agencies, nonprofits, and the outdoor industry an opportunity to learn about the vital role of outdoor access and public lands in our health and well-being and quality of life. And it's also meant to deepen our understanding and leadership skills around issues of race and equity as they relate to the outdoors. And it's with this in mind that I want to take a moment to acknowledge that our communities in San Diego sit on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay Nation. We extend our respect and gratitude to the Kumeyaay peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. And as you know, we're asking you to share in the chat box just a few words, what brings you here today. And we look forward to you continuing to share in the chat box throughout this session today. Now, during our previous webinar, we talked about systemic challenges in outdoor access and land management, particularly perceptual barriers. By raising awareness as to what some of these barriers look like for different groups of people and how we can alleviate their negative impacts, we can start improving outdoor access with an eye toward equity and inclusion in our own work. And a number of people said they really resonated with Richard Bugbee when he encouraged us to move from a management mindset to a relationship mindset, calling upon us to remember our relationships with the land, water, plants, and animals. And it's important to rethink our public lands, not as something to control and manage, but as an extension of ourselves, our larger living family. As Teresa Baker and Jose Gonzalez noted, we also need to rethink in the broadest terms what the outdoors represent to an increasingly diverse public. And it's important for us to challenge historical representations of who is a conservationist, who's outdoorsy, who is an expert in stewarding natural resources. So today's webinar will pick up where we left off on these themes to discuss the physical and functional barriers to outdoor access and land management. And despite the numerous benefits that there are to being outdoors, whether they're psychological, spiritual, physical, and otherwise, we still lack inclusivity and equity in this space. So we come together for this series to rethink the outdoors. And as with any educational experience that's truly transformative, this series is meant to challenge your current understanding of our public lands and related issues of conservation, access, and use. And we encourage you to sit with and reflect upon the insights and perspectives offered by our different speakers, because all of you are going to be a part of what happens next as we gain a richer understanding about our public lands by hearing from more diverse voices. What does our new shared story become? And how do we chart a path forward for the next century, in the next decades, together, looking at our common love for the natural heritage that constitutes what's now our public trust, found both in the vast and wild open spaces of our state and national parks, as well as you'll hear today, our more urbanized and confined refuges of nature that we have in many communities across the country. Before we go into this morning's speakers, I'd like to go over a few logistics. Our virtual webinar series convenes monthly from 9 to 11 a.m. Pacific time through December. And a smaller group of you will and have been participating in our leadership seminars, which include a capstone project. The leadership seminars are led by our very own Dr. Zachary Green, and they convene immediately after the webinar. You have been provided with a separate Zoom link for that webinar if you're part of that cohort that's participating. And now I'd like to turn this session over to Lesford Duncan, my esteemed colleague, who is Senior Director of Programs at Outdoor Outreach. And Les will be facilitating the conversation among our speakers today. Take it away, Les.
Thanks so much, Emily, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, Emily, for laying that foundation and that build up to today's session that we're so excited about. And so I'd like to just go over the format of today's session and introduce you to our phenomenal guest speakers. First, we will hear from two speakers, my esteemed colleagues and friends, Myrian Solis Coronel and Heather Rosetti. who will talk about their background, what got them into outdoor equity work, what inspires them to do the work that they're doing now in the organizations that they work with. Heather will also share some of the key findings from the San Diego Foundation's Parks for Everyone report. We will then move into a panel discussion with Heidi Vonblum with the City of San Diego Planning Department, Julie Corrales with the Environmental Health Coalition, and Leslie Reynolds with Groundwork San Diego and the Choice Creek Coalition, followed up with a Q&A with the audience. So throughout today's program, as we explore issues of race, of equity, of inclusion in public lands, I want you to, again, think about what gets activated within you. Think about what actions are suggested by what you learn here. Think about what you can do from your role, from your position, to be more of a leader for outdoor equity. We invite you to use this time, this space, as an opportunity for both self-reflection, as well as an opportunity to learn collectively and to examine the systems that we work within. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first two amazing speakers and dear colleagues, Myrian Solis Coronel and Heather Rosetti. Myrian has over a decade, or has decades of experience creating partnerships with underserved communities to improve their representation in the outdoors. Beyond her current role as Director of Community Engagement for California Parks, or for Parks California, she recently led REI's Next Gen Marketing Program, which developed national partnerships with communities often left out of traditional outdoor narratives. She has worked at KPBS, San Diego's PBS and NPR broadcasting service, as an event manager developing outreach campaigns. She was a board member for I Love a Clean San Diego and Mana de San Diego, and she also co-created the Latina Giving Circle. From 2013 to 2019, she was the chair of the California State Park and Recreation Commission, becoming their first Latina chair. Myrian also played an instrumental role in catalyzing the San Diego Foundation's work on park access starting more than a decade ago. Heather manages the Thrive Outside community initiative at the San Diego Foundation, which increases meaningful and reinforcing outdoor opportunities for youth and families across San Diego County. Before her work with Thrive Outside, Heather was a program specialist at the foundation, analyzing key objectives in the community impact department. Throughout her time at the foundation, Heather has played a key role in creating the Parks for Everyone Report 2.0, which sheds light on the disparity that exists in San Diego County in regards to green space access. With the report's data, the foundation intended to spark community dialogue and action to ensure all San Diegans have access to an outdoor space. For the next 45 minutes or so, Myrian and Heather are going to share the arc of their stories working on issues of outdoor access and inclusion and belonging. They will then engage in a back and forth conversation, asking each other questions, and relieving me of the responsibility of trying to moderate such a robust dialogue. So Myrian, let's go ahead and start with you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Les and Emily, for this opportunity. I was checking the chat and a few people were talking about reflection. And as you were reading a few pieces of my, the work that I've done, I can't believe it's been a couple of decades. Like, how did that happen? I used to be the youngest in the room. Now I'm not. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. One of the things that I've noticed over the course of my professional career is this blend of what is my passion, what do I care for deeply, what is part of my DNA and my values, and how can I integrate a lot of that into my professional work. And I've been really fortunate to be able to do that from a very young age. When I was at San Diego State, I was an intern at KPBS. And I interned for probably close to a year before I graduated, and then got hired to work full time. And working there was really a transformational experience for me because it's a large system, but it's a very local system too. It's about local voices. And at the time I was working in community engagement, and it was about how do we engage communities with the programming as a source of education and information and ensure that all folks in San Diego saw themselves in that space. So I got to do amazing awareness campaigns that involved community engagement and media, which was really, really fun. And after doing that for maybe 7 years, I believe, 7, 8 years, I got recruited to join the co-op, which was, interestingly enough, at the time, I had no idea what REI was. Or what they stood for. Like, I knew them as the retailer and that they had great stuff, quality stuff, but I didn't know much about it. And it was because I was a runner and I practiced yoga and I was a hiker, but I mean, I did that with my Nikes and I did that with my yoga pants. I didn't really need that technical gear for it. So as I was talking with them, I learned more about their values, what they stood for, and more importantly, learned about the work that they were talking to me about. I'm like, oh, well, that sounds fascinating. And the recruitment was specifically to launch a pilot. It was at the time, this was around 2008, REI was really investing in how can they better engage the Latino community in San Diego. And having had that experience that I had from KPBS, they thought that I could really help them. So I joined them, and it was also at a time when REI was really looking at recruitment, retention of underrepresented employees in the workforce, and then also what kind of training does it need to have, and what kind of stories need to be shared to ensure that not just employees, but also customers saw themselves in the co-op. So it was a fascinating time. I was doing that pilot and I ran that pilot in San Diego it started in San Diego, it expanded to Southern California very quickly. I ran it for 3 years, and then I had a counterpart in Atlanta who was running a similar pilot, but focused in the Black American community. So ran that pilot for 3 years. We took our learnings and then shared best practices across the co-op. And as some of you may know, one of the things that the co-op does is also gets involved in the community, building partnerships, elevating voices, sharing how people are connecting to the outdoors. At that time, the early stages, it was very much the traditional narrative of train to summit something big, right? So it was through a lot of the partnerships, a lot of the research that we did, a lot of the listening that we did, that we actually ended up finding what was common about the core audience of REI and then communities that were not seen at REI, and how can we lift those voices and invite them to the conversation. So we started doing more of that, what I thought was successful in integrating as much as we could into existing bodies of work and not looking at it as that is the diversity initiative, that is that budget, that is that person that leads that body of work, but really working with people to get comfortable and saying, yes, I don't know, but this is what's within my resources and my toolkit. How can I embed it into that? And that just creates this sense of inviting, like inclusion, even for folks that didn't feel comfortable to say, I don't know, but I'm willing to take the risk and potentially say something that does not come across the way I intended it to be, but I want to do that. So if there is any advice and learning that I got there is finding the people that are willing to say, how can I integrate this in the work that I'm doing and share that power for change? Find those folks and do the work together. It is that type of personality and that type of partnership that would allow to create that system change while also sharing their peers and sharing with their peers that change can happen. Les, give me a time check because I did not check what time I started. I want to make sure that I don't go over.
No, absolutely. You still have 2 or 3 more minutes.
Perfect. So that experience, what led to that experience was also it was, working at a retailer. I was in marketing, so working at a retailer, December is kind of like, don't engage with the retail staff, which ends up being like 75% of the workforce. So it was December and it was a little slow for me at work. And I started researching, where can I get involved? What can I do? I was finishing off my term at Mana de San Diego. And I had noticed, based on other research that I had done, that a lot of Latinas were not serving on commissions and boards. So I went to the state of California and looked at the boards and commissions and just started looking at who had vacancies. What was my passion point? Where would I like to volunteer? So I nominated myself to join the Parks Commission and submitted my application. And a week later, I got a call from the director at the time. And I think he was as surprised as I was to get his call. He's like, hey, I was looking at your application and why are you interested? And it was more of a sense of folks that self-nominate tend to be a particular age, tend to be a particular demographic, that when he saw my name and my age, he's like, oh, tell me more. And also tell me about like all this work that you're doing at REI, because here at State Parks, we're trying to do a lot of the same thing. So we had a great hour-and-a-half conversation. And then he said, after that conversation, are you okay if I formally submit your nomination for the governor to consider you for appointment? So of course I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, please. So I got appointed to that commission and I served for 6 years, and it was one of the most amazing experiences that I had, because I got to work with people who often at the co-op we were sending to, inviting people to the outdoors. So this was kind of like both of my worlds coming together. And just to share something really big that is happening today is it's a commission meeting. I had to step off because of my current role. But the commission, one of the pieces within their authority is general plans, the approval of general plans, and another big one is the naming or renaming of state parks. And today I'm going in front of the commission is the recommendation to rename Patrick's Point State Park up in Northern California to Sumeg State Park. And that's to honor the Yurok community and the people of that area who have cared for that place for many, many years. So it's a big deal. It is the first of its kind to go in front of the commission. There have been many people involved in this, from the ground level up to agency. So and by agency, natural resources agency. So if this vote happens, I see it as the beginning of much more change, not just happening here in our state of California, but also across the nation. So with that, I'll wrap it up, Les.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Myrian. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Heather Rosetti.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm so humbled and honored to be here amongst these amazing speakers. Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to share some of the findings from the Parks for Everyone report. And I just want to start by saying I am an aspiring ally and still learning and learning alongside all of you. So thank you for having me. Okay, I'd first like to start with this photo here. Pictured here is a family trying to pass a trail in Borderfield State Park. Having not seen their family members from Mexico in over 15 years, they were determined to reach Friendship Park. As the vehicle road was closed due to flooding, they had to walk 1.8 miles each way and push their small children in strollers through mud and water contaminated with runoff from the crosswater flows of the Tijuana estuary. Oftentimes, officials have closed the entire park to the public, including pedestrians, due to the conditions of the foot trails. And why does this matter? Why is access to parks and green space so important? Parks not only improve the quality of life and physical health, but provide venues to bring people together across social, economic, and racial divides to build more resilient, socially connected communities. So let's take a step back. In 2010, the San Diego Foundation commissioned the Parks for Everyone report to better understand gaps in access to green space in the San Diego region. Through the report, we discovered that while more than 45% of San Diego County's total land area is green space, many communities have limited access. The lack of access has decreased engagement in the outdoors, directly impacting both the mental and physical health of our youth and families. And pictured here is an updated map in the 2020 Parks for Everyone report. The map shows that though the region is rich in green space, many communities still lack equitable access to parks and nature. The blue areas indicate less than 8 acres of parkland per 1,000 people and below 51,000 median household income. The communities that suffer from the greatest inequities are those with higher concentrations of low-income households, communities with greater racial and ethnic diversity, and higher rates of COVID-19 infections. A growing body of scientific evidence supports that people with less access to the outdoors have worse health outcomes than their peers. The pandemic has exacerbated systemic inequalities and is impacting communities of concern at disproportionately high rates. And before we jump into why these inequalities persist, let's define access. Physical access is related to the geographical placement and physical attributes surrounding a designated location that considers infrastructure, location, natural and built environments, temporary obstructions, and street conditions that enable or disable access to a place. Functional access is related to other aspects that are not physical or place-based that enable or disable access to a designated location. Functional access considers other external and contextual factors that influence access in various ways. These factors could include cost, permitting and capacity, property ownership, political will, policing frequency, neighborhood, safety crime, transit frequency and schedules, cultural, linguistic influences, and climate change impacts. Now that we have a better understanding of access, let's try and understand why we are still seeing inequities in access. In the 2020 Parks for Everyone report, we learn about equity barriers. Equity barriers are obstacles that hinder a person's ability to access green space in parks. First, we have safety. In the opening slide, we saw an example of a safety barrier with the family that was trying to pass a flooded trail. Public safety remains a leading barrier to parks and green space. Risk factors include both real and perceived barriers, which can include everything from poor trail conditions to security concerns for families and children. Other obstacles include walkability, transportation, fees, permits and expenses, and cultural inclusion. Next, we have walkability. Many of the region's parks and open space lack the proper street access to and walkability that is critical for pedestrians to enjoy the outdoors. For example, there are over 150 canyons throughout urban San Diego, and yet only a small portion are accessible. Many are overrun with invasive species, trash, and other factors making them not accessible to residents. Pictured here is a restoration project led by San Diego Canyonlands, who received an Opening the Outdoors grant from the San Diego Foundation to mentor youth through habitat restoration. In the before photo, you can see the landscape was fraught with overgrown invasive species, hindering walkability and any sort of native plant life. Youth from Urban Corps helped remove hundreds of pounds of trash and invasive plants from the site, prepared it for planting, and controlled potential erosion. Youth created accessible, welcoming space and planted over 250 native plants for the community to enjoy. Next, let's consider transportation. Without access to a vehicle or nearby public transit stops, many families are unable to visit local parks, beaches, or open space. As you can see from Google Maps, a trip from El Cajon to Ocean Beach that would take 20 to 25 minutes by car can take up to 2 hours by public transit. Another equity barrier covered in the report is fees, permits, and expenses. For groups that face systemic barriers to outdoor access, including communities of color, people with physical disabilities, and low-income youth, subsidized and culturally appropriate outdoor engagement programs can be a critical entry point to open space. However, land management policies can present significant obstacles to the nonprofit organizations that provide equitable access to parks and beaches. Oftentimes, special event permits are required that limit equitable access programs to certain dates, less desirable locations, and low frequency of activities. Special event fees can be prohibitive. For example, just the fees to run a 4-hour beach event for a group of 12 youth, such as the outdoor outreach group pictured here, can be as high as $240. And finally, we have cultural inclusion. When youth from underrepresented communities do not see themselves represented in outdoor staff and leadership positions, we are excluding large groups of diverse youth from outdoor engagement, access, and jobs. Additionally, when park signage, maps, events, and other information leading folks to green space are not presented in multiple languages, we exclude large groups of people from accessing the environment. Opening the Outdoors grantee Indigenous Regeneration created hiking trails and signage with the goal of making green space more welcoming and accessible to Native youth, community members, and members of regional tribes. With the inclusion of the Kumeyaay language and signage shown here, Indigenous Regeneration is prioritizing equity and access and community engagement. We know that people with less access to the outdoors have worse health outcomes than their peers. Creating safe, readily accessible access to the outdoors is a step for all as we build better health, resilience, and quality of life. Thank you for taking the time to learn about the Parks for Everyone report findings. And next, Myrian and I are going to explore how these findings have been used and their broader ramifications for efforts to promote more inclusive outdoor access.
Thank you so much, Heather, to walking us through that great report. So what became findings? Tell us how the report really influenced your community grant making program.
Yes, absolutely. And in response to the 2010 report findings, a movement began to emerge to connect diverse communities to experience the outdoors in a more meaningful way. And the foundation created the Opening the Outdoors program to connect and increase equitable access to the outdoors, in particular for those communities identified with low park access in the report. And through the program, strategic investments have been made in communities with low park access. And at the end of the 2020 report, there is a map that shows the areas of grant focus where you can see grant making has been targeted for the areas that were identified in both 2010 and the 2020 reports. And since the 2010 report came out, the foundation has invested over $179 million for land acquisition and stewardship. Over 90 nonprofit organizations have been supported, and over 50,000 youth and families have accessed the outdoors. And most recently, the 2021 Opening the Outdoors grant cycles were crafted entirely around the 2020 Parks for Everyone report findings, and applicants were asked to share how they're addressing the equity barriers that were outlined in the report.
That's amazing. That's so great to hear, one, the findings and how that influenced and supported communities that are on the ground creating that change. Congratulations on that. Can you share maybe an example of a specific grant that the San Diego Foundation has made that has addressed the central challenges outlining in the report?
Yes, for sure. And there are some that are shown in the report, but I'm super excited about many of our newest 2021 grantees that came after the report was published. And I actually have 3 that I'd love to share. We have Pan-African Family Union has a program called the African Women's Health and Wellness Project, which is working to increase mental and physical well-being of African women by creating a comfortable and supportive environment for immigrant and refugee women to feel safe and experience the outdoors. We also have Via International, who is leading efforts to improve public access to the San Diego Borderfield State Park, which we saw in the slides that I just shared and is also highlighted in the Parks for Everyone report. And they're helping to grow a leadership network among South Bay residents to support park development efforts. And they hosted several events back in August celebrating the 50th anniversary of Borderfield State Park. And we also have Wild Coast. They have a coastal connectors program that trains local youth leaders from tribal and park deficient communities and equips them with the tools they need to become effective leaders and stewards in ocean conservation and climate stewardship. I could go on and on, but I'll stop there.
Yes, I mean, really, how can you? There's so many amazing. You know, right now that you're talking about Via Internacional, it reminded me of a podcast that was launched during the celebration of the 50th anniversary, and it's Divided Together. And it really brings stories of the area from different perspectives. So if y'all get a chance, check that out. It's on all the podcast distribution channels.
Yes, that's amazing. Thank you for mentioning that as well. And Myrian, I've already learned so much more about you than I already knew from your opening comments. And I'd love to hear more about what your role was in the first Parks for Everyone report, and where have you seen the impact of the report over the past decade?
I remember this from my early days. It was, Emily, I remember I was part of your, when you were at the foundation, I was part of the Environment Review Committee. One of the things that I think collectively we found is that there wasn't enough data that really captured what we were living and experiencing in San Diego. And we can talk about it. And often for people that are getting their head around this concept, talking about it sometimes is not enough. They need evidence. They need data from third party to say, oh, okay, what you're saying is also here. And yes, there is a need. And this is the percentage, and here is visually a map of that. So it is with that vision and that intent of gathering a report that really spoke to the San Diego needs that at the time when I was at REI, I said, yeah, we need it. We need that evidence. We also needed, right, at the time when I was doing community engagement and when I was at REI, to say, let's bring some of the resources that we have as an organization to invest on this body of work, which is not just about a report, but what the report will do after that. It will create more dialogue. It will create a benchmark. It'll give us data points that we can reflect on to track what change we're making. So what started as, wouldn't it be great to have something? Often great ideas start like that, right? Brought in the resources to really underwrite that, and being a thought partner. I don't underestimate the value of being a thought partner when it comes to conversations like this. It is the energy, it is the thought partnership that really the relationship that moves things forward. So if you have the opportunity or an idea, socialize that, get a partner to create that change. Where do I see this happening over the next few decades to come? Like I said, it becomes a benchmark. Like, how great will it be? You've done a revised version to capture what is the change that is happening, and how can we continue to evolve in this space? For me, it becomes a data point that also becomes part of the story and the impact story.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for those comments. And how would you say that you use those data points and storytelling to make change reality in everyday work with your partnerships with online communities, as well as grant making for outdoor access and inclusion?
Oh, so much in here. Okay. Let's talk about, since we were talking about data, data, I mean, is so valuable. I don't know the mechanics of how to get there, but I understand and appreciate getting that final story from the experts that can get us there. We at Parks California, what we do is we try to measure the impact of programs while also capturing the impact of our partners, because we know that that just helps everyone, right? It is the evidence that we need to create change. There's no way of disputing that. It does not become a passion piece, but it really is tracked on behavior change and those metrics. So Using that information is what we use to then create that story. Creating story of impact, one, there's different ways of telling it. My approach and our approach has been, how do we uplift the organizations that are on the ground creating this amazing work and really engaging with communities, right? To create those meaningful moments in nature, conserving land. How do we take those stories and that data to uplift and celebrate the work that they're doing for many reasons? One, to also let people that they're reaching just see themselves in the work. So is it a blog? Is it a video? Is it an interview? How can we integrate that there? And using the data point to then say, and if you're interested, especially for funders, to say, and if you're interested to continue on this change and impact, then invest, be a partner, volunteer, join us on the board, whatever it might be, it becomes even more enticing to say, don't just watch, act with us, join us. So that would be on the community piece. In the grant making, let me think about this. Using data point as well as grant making. I mean, one of the things that we often look at, because we have a grants program, which you are a part of in our review committee. Thank you, Heather, for that. It's often also looking at who has considered and applied for those opportunities, and where are the areas where they're not, and how can we go in and proactively engage with those communities to ensure that resources go there. What I often seen is that a lot of these organizations are small, right? Sometimes they might subcontract a development or a grant writer. So the operations are lean and they're dedicated in the mission of the organization doing the work that they're doing. So sometimes opportunities pass because they're so immersed in the work. So how can we get this in front of them and make it easy? I think that's the other piece. How can we make this application process easy and lead with trust? Because they're on the ground, they know what to do. They just need the investment and the resources to make it happen so that we can support them in the work that they're doing. So that would be some thoughts.
Thank you so much. I can definitely relate to a lot of what you just said with our own grant making too. And what you said about needing evidence to support our claims is so spot on. And in some ways that I've seen the Parks Urban Report information used for advocacy, for fundraising, as an educational tool. With advocacy, through Thrive Outside, we're trying to use these findings to engage key local, state, and federal change makers to support improved policies and increase funding for outdoor engagement. We've had several meetings with elected officials who represented the findings, and last fall we were able to host a community conversation at Voice of San Diego's annual PolitiFest, which is a public affairs summit that focuses on issues affecting San Diego communities. And I've also seen, reports for fundraising, reports, both of the Parks Urban reports cited in proposals to the foundation, and we've also used it in proposals that we've worked on for other funders. And of course, similar to meetings with electeds, we've seen it used in meetings with donors as educational tools, learning opportunities like today. And recently we were able to present Parks Urban findings during an educational session at the Outdoor Industry Association's Outdoor Retailer Summer Show. So we had an audience of outdoor industry professionals, which was an amazing opportunity to lift up these issues and our work.
I think Myrian may have fallen off for just a bit, but to keep the conversation going, I think maybe one question I would pose to you, Heather, is how does all of this work together with the Thrive Outside initiative? And could you maybe share a little bit with the group a little bit about the Outdoor Foundation's Thrive Outside initiative in collaboration with the San Diego Foundation?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Les. So the Parks Urban Report raises issue about equity and access. And then so we think, what comes next? What can we do about this? And the Thrive Outside initiative is an excellent example of a focused and strategic investment that's really needed to move the needle and affect change. So for those that are not familiar with Thrive Outside, in 2019, San Diego was chosen by the Outdoor Foundation as one of the 4 inaugural Thrive Outside communities. And the core goal of the initiative is to create healthy individuals, communities, and economies by making the outdoors a habit through repeat and meaningful outdoor experiences. And in San Diego, we're working to address barriers and strengthen collaboration and regional efforts to promote equitable outdoor experiences for children and families. And prior to the Thrive Outside initiative, we were kind of an informal community network. We didn't have a common agenda. And through Thrive Outside, each of the partner organizations have really come together to create a collective impact model. And partners include our friends here at the Nonprofit Institute, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Outdoor Outreach, the YMCA, the County of San Diego Parks and Recreation, and Parks California. And the foundation is working as the backbone organization. And something that's really unique about the San Diego network is that it's really diverse in its cross-sector makeup of partners. Oh, Myrian's back. Hi, Myrian. Perfect timing.
About that. Thank you, Les, for stepping in. Internet went down.
No worries. Perfect timing for my next question for you.
Oh.
I was just sharing a little bit about Thrive Outside and how the San Diego network is really unique with our diverse cross-sector makeup of partners. And you work in the cross-sector space between business, government, and nonprofits, which can be a challenge. So how do you modify the language in your approach based on your audience to make sure everyone can join together and collaborate?
Oh my gosh, such a great question, because every space is so unique, right? I mean, it has been fascinating to professionally and personally be in all of those spaces, to be a volunteer as a commissioner, now working in partnership with California State Parks for the work that we're doing at Parks California, being a nonprofit, and then having had spent a good part of my career at REI. One of the things that I have learned is that in general, for the most part, and it must be, there's a lot of good intent and people do want to create change. It's just where and how to start. And depending on the sector, what I've noticed is that some of them are more comfortable with risk than others. So what I've learned is in the listening, as we engage, kind of start building a relationship, kind of gauge their comfort level and start a thought partnership about what we can do to create change. And change is incremental, right? Because if it happens overnight, then like there's something happening. Like I don't know what can happen overnight, but really change happens incremental, and it's adopted when it's incremental too, because then you're able to bring others along. What I often do is kind of identify where is that and how do we steward that process going forward. Just in general, this space of inclusion and belonging is kind of like this progression, right? You start somewhere and you continue to get more comfortable, you continue to grow. So for me, it has been a lot of just asking questions in addition to listening about, well, why is this done this way? How we thought about doing it this way? Are we doing it because it has just been happening that way, or because it has to be done that way? And an example that I shared before being dropped off was the trust-based. And I think trust-based philanthropy is one thing, but I think we can take that approach across any conversation and just leading with one, empathy, and also trust. When we listen to communities know what they need. So why do we have to make it super complicated for them to garner these resources so they can do the great work that they're doing? So can we use some of that to just make it much more flexible for communities? The other thing that I've learned too is that depending on your audience, some words in this space can be really uncomfortable. So I think as much learning that we can do to say, okay, what is comfortable? How can we meet at the middle so that we both understand what we're trying to say while using same words, but kind of same meaning to get us to where we want to go. And sometimes it's having a difficult, what could be at the moment a difficult conversation, but that transparency will just make things much more productive. So that would be another piece that I would share.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for those insights. And that your point about change being incremental, I think is so important, because I think even I know myself get frustrated if things aren't changing quickly, but to keep that in mind is really important. And then just one final question. Where do you see this work going in the next decade?
Oh my gosh.
I
know where I would want it to go. You know, I know we have some friends here from the East Coast. I'm part of a roundtable for the New York State Park System. And one of the committee members said, and it sticks to me because it's so true, it's not just about bringing people to the table, but inviting them to the prep kitchen. Like, don't just like, let's all figure out what's going to be served instead of getting served, right? So I think this sense of recognition, bringing people to the brainstorm and identifying what are the elements of the brainstorm so we can brainstorm together is the other thing that I think we're seeing more of. And then the other piece that I've, it's not a new movement, but I've seen it grow more recently is the sense of co-creation. Co-creation of place to co-creation of experiences to co-creation even when it comes to recruitment. So I think this sense of sharing power and bringing people as part of that journey is probably going to be seen a little bit more. It might be slower in some sectors or it might be more progressive in others, but I think I'm seeing it more than I have seen just even in the past 5 years. What about you, Heather?
Oh, yes. Like, as I kind of mentioned, I feel like I'm one of those people that's just like wants to see the change immediately happening. And I think just through the work that we're doing collaboratively with Thrive Outside, I'm really excited about what's to come in the next few years in San Diego and nationwide. I think that hopefully we can lead by example here and continue to learn and support each other. And it's really exciting.
Well, thank you so much, Heather, for this conversation.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm humbled to be paired up with you. So thank you so much for spending your morning with me.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you both, Myrian and Heather, for just sharing your stories and holding such an important and engaging conversation. And you know, while I know that none of us have kind of that magical glass ball to be able to tell what the future will look like, I think from, you know, based on the conversation, I dropped a quote into the chat box from Myrian. It's not about bringing people to the table, it's about also inviting them to the prep kitchen. We know that, you know, in whatever direction the future goes, it needs to be inclusive. It needs to be truly and authentically inclusive of all people, of all ideas, in order to be able to overcome some of the biggest intractable issues of our century, of our decade. So thank you both for leading that conversation, for inspiring. We'll hold questions until we hear from our next panel speakers. And that said, please feel free to post any questions that you have that's coming up for you in the chat box. And so at this moment, I just want to take a brief pause before we go into the next conversation. I'd like to really ask the audience to make note of what it is that you've heard, that you may never have heard before, that you may have heard it in a different way. And as you do that, take some time to really reflect on it, maybe jot down some key notes for yourself, maybe even some action items, and set that aside as something to then pick back up later and to really look at and reflect on how does this integrate into my work as a practitioner, as a professional, as a leader for outdoor equity. Hope you see what I did there. And now I'd like to introduce our next panel of phenomenal speakers, including Heidi Vonblum, Julie Corrales, and Leslie Reynolds. These three have been some phenomenal champions here at the local level in San Diego, at the nexus of environmental justice, park development and park planning and city planning, and have really been tackling many of the inequities that Heather brought up from the Parks for Everyone report, some of the inequities in access to outdoor spaces. And so by way of introduction, Heidi is the Deputy Director of Environmental Policy and Public Spaces for the City of San Diego's Planning Department. From 2009 to 2018, she served as the Deputy City Attorney in San Diego's Land Use and Environment Office. And from 2007 to 2009, she worked at Foley and Lardner LLP practicing environmental regulation law. Before obtaining her law degree from the University of San Diego, Heidi was an environmental planner for Environmental Science Associates. Next, I'd like to introduce Julie, and we serve together on the Environmental Justice Working Group of the Community Budget Alliance. Growing up in City Heights and now living in Barrio, Logan, Julie experienced firsthand the harmful effects of systemic racism and environmental injustice. In 2016, she began volunteering for the grassroots organization People Over Profit San Diego to impact criminal justice reform. In 2018, she joined the Environmental Health Coalition, where she is currently fighting against environmental racism as a Barrio Logan policy advocate. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to Leslie. Since 2010, Leslie has been the executive director of the environmental nonprofit Groundwork San Diego and the Choice Creek Coalition. She oversees their Choice Creek Enhancement Program in partnership with the City of San Diego. Groundwork's overall goal is to bring sustained regeneration, improvement, and management of the physical environment through community-based partnerships, which empower people, businesses, and organizations to promote environmental, economic, and social well-being. Heidi, Julie, and Leslie, if you could please, in that order, share your opening reflections on what you've heard from Myrian and Heather, and kind of opening us to some of the work that you're doing to address outdoor inequities.
I guess I will start. Thank you, Les. As Les mentioned, I work in the city's planning department, and I have had the privilege and enjoyment to work with our other two panel members over the past several years on addressing park inequities in our system. Primarily, the City of San Diego City Council adopted this summer our Parks for All of Us initiative, which included an update to the City of San Diego's Parks Master Plan. Our Parks Master Plan in the City of San Diego had not been updated in over 50 years. So as you can imagine, it did not address inequities. It's silent on the need to prioritize investments in the areas where they were needed. Our policies, quite frankly, were just completely outdated. And that process of changing the conversation was difficult. It was met with a lot of resistance. But fortunately, I think just beginning in 2020, the conversation started to shift, and we were able to get a lot more traction and really work towards positive change, which is just really exciting. And I've worked in the government pretty much my entire career, and change is hard to come by. But luckily, if you have enough energy, you can still make it happen. And it can't be done without partners, such as Julie and such as Leslie, to help us get there. A lot of people can get frustrated with the planning process because it's slow and we don't see change happening for many, many, many years. But I really see it as an important first step to having change happen. We cannot see change happen unless we change the conversation. A place we have the opportunity to do that is through our planning policies and really bold statements about what's important to us as a city. Overall, I don't want to take up too much time, Les, so just cut me off when it needs to go. But you know, overall, the city of San Diego is a diverse jurisdiction. It's diverse geographically. It's very large. It also has a diverse population with very different needs throughout the city. Our development patterns represented, you know, a lot of focus on in the past several decades on suburban development, which tends to house a certain type of population. And it has resulted in policies that have favored investments in the newer, wider, and more affluent areas of the city, and have largely ignored the need to provide investments in the areas of the city that not only have the greatest needs, but also house the greatest amount of people. And so I kind of say that over and over and over again. We need to be investing in the areas with the greatest needs, and we also need to be investing in the areas that serve the most people. And that, when we look at our mapping, I mean, mapping is a really cool thing when you're a planner, right? Those overlay perfectly. You know, it's really just phenomenal the position that I've been in to be able to see how everything can work together within the planning department. Not only do I oversee park planning, but I also oversee all of our environmental policy, our open space and conservation efforts, as well as our infrastructure planning, which includes the implementation of development impact fees and the spending of those as well. And so we, as part of the Parks for All of Us initiative, one of the things that we did is we moved away from community by community based planning for infrastructure and said, you know what, look, we are one city, one system, and we need to be planning for an interconnected system. And we need to stop it, you know, with really just only focusing on investing where, you know, where the money is. I could kind of go on for hours and hours and hours about this, but just our fee system alone was just destined to create inequities. The fee structure ranged from as low as $0 per housing unit to as high as $30,000 per housing unit. And the lower fees were concentrated in the poor communities. And then we restricted that money to only be spent in the areas in which it was collected. And so this just resulted in these beautiful parks throughout the city of San Diego for some of us, but certainly not for all of us. Not only were they not available in the communities in which they were located, they weren't available to be traveled to easily by anybody else outside of the community. So I'm proud to say that we've adopted new policies in the city of San Diego as of August of 2021 that say that equity is a priority in investing in our park system. And I'll kind of leave it off there and also just give my gratitude to so many people that are sharing their time here, especially Julie and Leslie, who helped us get there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Heidi. Turning the floor over to Julie next.
Hi, thanks, Les. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, so I have been working alongside Heidi and Leslie to try to increase park equity in San Diego, and specifically in Barrio Logan, where I've been living for the last 5 years. As Les mentioned, I grew up in City Heights. I mean, you know, the personal is political, and you know, I remember being a kid and living in not a very safe few blocks, and with my friends putting a half deflated basketball into a plastic bag and then tying that with rope to a stop sign to play tetherball. And so, like, you know, I remember not having access that other folks did. And so that has, you know, the personal has always fueled my experience and the change that I try to make. As Les mentioned, I work for the Environmental Health Coalition. We have about 40 years in the region, in the San Diego region, Tijuana region, working to advance environmental justice, you know, focusing in communities that are highly impacted by toxic pollution. And it's funny that Heidi, you know, mentions maps, because the communities that are highly impacted by pollution are also the ones that are the most Black and brown, that are also the ones that have been historically divested in, and the ones that have the least parks, right? And so it's all on top of each other. And so we've been working to try to fix that. One thing that we try to bring to the forefront is the pollution, the environmental injustice, and why parks are even more needed in our communities because of the air quality and the benefit. So parks benefit everyone, right? They have direct links to physical activity and healthy lifestyles, but you put that in a community that's impacted by bad air quality and shortened lifespans because of it, amongst other health problems. And then you're turning the tide there, because then you're cleaning up the air. And when you approach park planning and park design in these communities with an eye towards cleaning up the air, we can go really far. So we've been trying to really spread that messaging and invest where it's most needed. Again, the difference between equity and equality. So it's already not equal at all, right, in the city where the parks are going and where the investments are going. But it's not about really making it equal. We need equity. We need the funds to go where they're most needed and quickly. And I know Heidi really worked hard to really reflect that in the work that she's been doing in the Parks Master Plan. And we're really grateful to have been able to work with her. A couple of the things that Myrian and Heather were talking about really rung true for me was, a trust community. It's so, and I really love the quote, right? Don't, we're fighting our way to the table, but we should be being invited to the prep kitchen, right? And so that's something me and Leslie can talk more about the amazing work she's doing about getting folks to the prep kitchen. When does community want to get engaged? And sometimes what we've been seeing in the past is that documents come, big policy plans come pretty much baked to the community, and then we're playing defense. And how do we get on the offense? How do we all get to the prep kitchen together? And to do that, I think we have to start thinking about uncomfortable things to think about. We have to start having uncomfortable conversations. Why are community members not doing this work on the other side of the table? Why aren't we, and Myrian touched on this, right? Why aren't Latinos and Blacks and people of color as represented on the other side of the table? And so we do have to think about the historical barriers to do this work professionally and work to kind of chip away at that. And that's uncomfortable. We have to think about white saviorism in roles of planning and on the other side of the table. I'm calling it that now, the other side of the table, right? And those are uncomfortable to think about, but it's in spaces like this where we can start to break that down and really remove some of those barriers. So that's where I'm coming from. Thank you for your time. And I'll pass it off to Leslie.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Les and Heidi. And first of all, thanks to everybody in the audience. I see there are 100 people on this call, and if we have 100 regional leaders thinking about equity, it is incredible. We're grateful to all of you, and it means that I think the change can happen. So thank you all for being a part of this. Also, let me thank Emily and her team for facilitating this discussion at a most important and opportune time in our city's history, when matters of equity, diversity, justice are really finally at the forefront of all of our collective decision-making. Groundwork works in the space of environmental justice, has been said, in the Chollas Creek watershed, which includes the communities of City Heights, Encanto, Barrio, Logan, and southeastern San Diego. Our work is informed by the vision put forth by these communities over 20 years ago through a document that Les referenced called the Chollas Creek Enhancement Program, approved then by the City Council. That vision called for a recognition of an investment in the many cultural, biological, and recreational assets and opportunities throughout our watershed, as well as a recognition of the harm done by redlining public infrastructure projects such as freeways, which have ruined our open space and our natural resources, divided our communities, channelization of and development all around the creek system, which used to be a fully functioning, beautiful creek where the elders tell us they river rafted from the eastern reaches all the way to San Diego Bay, where, by the way, there used to be dolphins. And other degradation of the watershed's precious Kumeyaay lands. And there's a dog here, so excuse me. Although it's taken 20 years, there could not be more collective excitement about the city's new Parks Master Plan, which under Heidi's really, really amazing leadership will advance the community's vision through the designation of the Chollas Creek Regional Park, about which I know a number of you have read. This designation is long overdue. It was suggested 20 years ago through the enhancement program. We've been working on it ever since, and it's finally here. The designation will bring planning, investment, and recognition to our watershed that's long been afforded all of the other watersheds in our region. You might think about San Diego Park, Otay River Park, San Diego River Park, San Diego, and others all through the area. And somehow over all this time, Chollas Creek has been ignored. And so with thanks to Heidi and everybody who participated, we're finally getting there. Outdoor access and equity in our communities of concern will require an integrated approach to park planning to include all of the issues that impact or are impacted by natural resources. Those considerations include heat, flooding, stormwater conveyance, urban canopies, active transportation, clean mobility, green infrastructure, environmental design, and so on. Other important issues are public safety, appropriate levels of service of police, fire, creek and natural resource management. And finally, park programming must be designed with and by the community in that sort of way that Myrian was talking about co-creation, and address the longstanding barriers felt by communities of color. One of the most important and I think exciting aspects of the Parks Master Plan is its commitment to an equity analysis informed completely by community voice. New models of community engagement are being developed right now by the city and by lots of community organizations, including the Chollas Creek Coalition. And what we're doing as a coalition, which is comprised of probably 20 or 30 organizations and resident leaders throughout our watershed. We convene monthly, and we are convening in part to prioritize projects throughout the watershed so that with the overwhelming needs here, those projects are not just, again, overwhelming and sidelined in the park's unfunded list or wherever they get to in the city's graveyard of park projects. So our goal really is to work collectively to prioritize and elevate and get funded, both through city funding and external funding, all of those Chollas Creek Coalition watershed priorities. But the coalition is also doing some other really interesting work, which is we're developing some principles of public engagement that we want to recommend to the city. And that's coming actually at an opportune time because the city is working on Blueprint San Diego and a number of other sort of policies about community engagement. One of the things we're quite certain of is that the city needs to come together to figure out ways to speak to community, not in silos of 6 or 8 different city departments, but with the real goal of collecting community voice and hearing it. And I was really interested to hear Heather and Myrian talk about metrics, because one of the things we're working towards is figuring out metrics around community engagement. Who has been talked to? What neighborhood group has been elevated? What are their neighborhood level concerns, not their watershed wide concerns, their neighborhood specific concerns, and how are those voices making their way to decisions? So I think those metrics are going to be really important so that it's not a survey here or something else there, but it's an actual collection of community voices. So I think that's about it, Les, and thank you.
There was so much packed into what each of you just shared, and I know that we're going to spend some time just kind of unpacking each of those elements. I think to kick off the questions for this panel, we would be remiss, and some of you touched on this, we'd be remiss in having this conversation about how we address inequities moving forward without talking about some of the historical ways or some of the historical urban planning policies that have gotten us here in the first place. And I was really inspired during the planning process for the city's Parks Master Plan. Heidi brought up in one of the conversations that honestly, the inequities that exist today are a result of poor city planning in the past decades long of poor city planning, from redlining over the past century to development impact fees, which Heidi mentioned. So wanted to kick off this conversation by putting this question out to the audience. Could you talk a little bit more about some of those historical urban policies that have resulted in some of the current day issues, and especially in a way that might be relevant to many of the land managers that are on this call today, to many of the community-based organizations and advocacy groups that are on the call with us today? And so, that question is open to the group. Maybe Heidi, if you'd like to kick it off.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of just endless policies. When I, still continue to, dig up some policies within the city that I read, you kind of see how it happens. I will say, having worked within the government, there's nobody in the government that's, intentionally perpetuating these. I don't think. I think what it mostly is that people get into a pattern of doing things the way that they're doing. I can personally tell you, now that we are implementing a citywide park development impact fee, and we had 60 days, from time of adoption to making it and implementing it. We're going to start implementing it in 15 days. It's a lot of work. I mean, I've actually thought to myself over the past several months, okay, only somebody that's insane would purposely sign up to try and implement this. This is crazy, right? Because
thank you, Heidi.
It's unwinding, like decades of institutional, systems and whatever, right? So, but you got to start somewhere, right? It's like I just got to do it. And I'm really proud to have been able to be able to implement that. I'm a little bit worried about a couple of things, in the next 15 days, but we're going to get there. Another thing, just throwing out some examples of things that, have really contributed to what we see today. I mentioned, the development patterns, the focus on serving the suburbs versus the, and when you focus on one area, it is to the detriment of another area. And so, when we talk about, the equality versus equity, it's not about investing equally. It's about investing equitably, and that means that we need to invest in the areas that need it, not in the areas that already have it. And so, that's what we're going to do. Another thing I'll just, kind of point out is we had a park standard that was focused solely on acquiring additional space for land. It was 2.8 acres of parkland per additional 1,000 residents in the city. And everybody loved it. There were just so many people that loved this standard because it was easy to implement. And because it was familiar to them, and it was consistent, not with the community as a whole, but with the people that traditionally participate within these plan processes. It was something that they really enjoyed. And so when you look at a suburban model of development, it's, large swaths of greenfield space. A developer provides, these massive acre parks, and that may be something that the community wants. What happens though, when you apply that type of standard in a more urban setting, which by the way is also aligned with our climate goals, because we want to see our housing in areas of transit, and we want to invest in transit in the areas that serve most people. And so really, we get to the situation, okay, well, we want to, increase housing opportunities for everybody in areas that align with our climate goals. But we also need park spaces that go with it. And there just simply is not 2.8 acres per 1,000 population. If you look at the population for downtown, that would cover almost all of the land area of downtown using that standard. And what I've seen happen is that we overlook opportunities to invest in communities when we can't add all of this additional space. I'm not saying that it's not important to add additional parkland into our park system at all. I think that that's continues to be important, but I don't think that we should ignore other opportunities to invest in our communities in the meantime. So the new Parks Master Plan did include a very controversial change to the standard that I just actually saw a little cartoon this week that said there's two choices to move forward, and it's simple but wrong answers, or complex but right answers, right? And then it kind of shows a line of people, like everybody goes towards the simple but easy answer. And I really kind of feel like that embodies like parks planning because the simple answer is to just, easy to implement. Let's just do it. We just calculate out acres. And we moved to a more complex standard and took a lot of heat for it. It is more complex. It is more complicated. It's harder to understand. But at the end of the day, really our hope is that it is the right answer. And where we run into problems, we will adjust. And I think that's really important working in the government, or for those of you not in the government, working with the government to understand and kind of change that conversation. There tends to be this idea in government that you just, always have to kind of keep doing the same thing. And so then the community kind of thinks, okay, well, they're never going to change it after it's adopted. And I really want to change that conversation of, let's work with the community, let's make changes, and let's continue to adjust, because life is just not static. So
Heidi may not be surprised that I'll give her a tiny bit of pushback about the issue of park land acquisition. And so from our perspective, it's not necessary, because Heidi's been hearing this from us and everybody else for 2 years. But it's not really an either or situation. It's not housing needs or parkland. And so as an example, we have 2 public projects right on Kumeyaay land and open space being proposed in the heart of Encanto. And so that is not about housing, it's about fire stations and MTS industrial yards. So I don't want everybody to go away thinking this is either housing or park acquisition, because it's more, as Heidi says, things are more complicated than that.
Yeah, I agree that they're more complicated than that. I really like what you said about simple but easy, just passing the buck. So I do want to say Heidi's made an effort to not pass the buck, because she just talked about, all the work that she's doing, digging in to change these systems that are so deep rooted. But I agree there is room for acquisition, especially like in surplus areas. I know Heidi knows we were struggling to get a piece of land from Caltrans that they had put up for sale. We figured out a way.
We're going to get it, Julie.
We got it, right? We're going to get it.
Yeah.
For park space. But I mean, I think there's opportunities, and I think the Parks Master Plan does kind of carve out some areas. I think there's a lot of, especially the Choyas Creek, Leslie, like just areas that the city can acquire. And so, but I do agree that, in urban areas, we have to be creative. We have to find those pocket parks. We have to do rooftop. We have to do these things that clean up, for me, the air, right? Because I can't not go back to the air. And I'm really not segueing, because it's related to greening, and these communities that are so affected by toxic air pollution, their life expectancy is 10 times less than north of the 8. 10 years less. I'm sorry, not 10 times, that'd be horrible. It is horrible still, 10 years less than north of the 8. Our kids are 3 times more likely to get asthma than the county average. Our nationwide cancer risk is in the 97th percentile. I'm not making this up. This is what this toxic air does to us. And so we need parks, we need greening, we need them on the roofs, we need them in the alleys, we need them in the pockets, we need them in creative spaces to really help us with our health. But I did want to go back a little bit to these public policies, these historical public policies. And I think that we have to get comfortable with saying it. Historically racist land use policies, right? They were racist. And I'm sure everyone here, or not sure, but I think most of us, or at least some of us, are familiar with redlining by now, right? The process in the 1930s, where banks went out into communities and said which communities they were not brown and black and were worth investing in, and that's where they would give, and the ones that were not black and brown and were worth investing in, that's where the home loans were given. That's where they invested in infrastructure and parks. And if you look at a map of how San Diego was redlined today, it is the same map that we're talking about, where the air quality is bad, where the parks are missing, where it's the same map. So yeah, I know that we want to say that we're past that, and in a lot of ways, I think we are shifting past that, and we see that in our leadership trying to remedy this. But in order to remedy these historic injustices, we have to admit the legacy. And I agree with Heidi that I do not think at all that there's anyone intentionally perpetuating this stuff. Absolutely not. But I think because of the very system that segregated us, redlining and the racial history, we don't get to see the way the other communities live so much, right? So how often does someone from La Jolla come down and really live in areas like Barrio Logan and experience those inequities firsthand? So then it kind of takes away a little bit of our empathy and a little bit of our really like being able to see what the problem is, and how unjust it is. So and then also the uncomfortableness of looking at it. Like, this is because of racist, history. And so we have to fix it now. I know where I do my work in Barrio Logan, we were zoned, now we have these great, amazing community plans, right? Community comes out and says, this is what we want to see in our community, listen to a city, and the city's like, okay, how can we make this happen? But, in areas like Barrio Logan in the 1930s as well, and again in the 50s and 60s, the community was not brought to the table. Decisions were made by, affluent white leadership that said, okay, well, that's where the brown people live, so let's put the port there. We're the only community in San Diego that is adjacent to the water that has no water access. They put all the industry there. They said they put the freeways through there. They systemically decided that this is where they would throw the refuse of the city, and that it would be on our backs. So how do we begin to remedy that, right? Things like Heidi mentioned, the citywide park fees, right? Like it's siloed, right? Like, oh, only this planning group can spend this money, and I think Heidi, I don't think you've touted this enough. I thought it was phenomenal and such a game changer in the new Parks Master Plan, citywide DIF fees. This is a citywide park system, right? We all go to Balboa Park, we all go to La Jolla Shores, it's a citywide park system. So why are only certain parts of the city being able to benefit from the funds where the buildings go in? So the citywide park fee, and I'll let Heidi talk more about it, I think is revolutionary and is really going to change the way we do things. But I think just keeping an eye towards that, it's not intentionally being perpetuated, but I think sometimes folks get into the idea of like, well, that's the way we always done it. The big controversy is single family zoning. Well, people want to live in single family zoning like this. Why are we talking about decimating this? Understood. But if you look at it historically, it was inherently racist. It was done for segregation. It was done. So like, okay, so let's take that and couple it with the truth that some people like to live in single family homes. And now let's find a way forward that addresses the historical injustices and all, you know what I mean? It can't continue the same way. So let's change it together with this information. So that's my rant. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, if I just, Julie, one thing that you said kind of like hit home for me is, people in La Jolla don't, go south of the 8 to see the parks there, and they should, right? We should have a system where people from all over the city want to go visit parks. It shouldn't just be those from, those that live south of the 8 are, oh, I want to go see these parks north of the 8. We should be able to integrate that across the city. One of the things that I heard a lot of my time throughout the development of this, the Parks Master Plan was, no, it's fine. The system is fine. Everything is fine. And it's not fine, right? We know that, right? But people that only live in La Jolla may not necessarily know that because they don't go down to, southeastern San Diego and see, the conditions of the parks, right? And so one of the things that I did, and I put a link to it in the chat, and this is not like high tech or tons of money that, was put into this. This is done with our, dedicated city staff. So I took my team of six of us, and we just spent a day, and we basically drove to as many parks north and south of the 8 as possible. And we just put it into a story map so people could see. So kind of, my thought was, okay, people are going to tell me that this system is fine. It is not fine, but how are people to know that if they don't, travel around the city? And so, one of the ways that we can do that is through storytelling. And this is just sort of a really kind of like low cost, low tech type of way to share that story of, it's different. They are different and not equal, and they're not equitable either. One of the things, that we've really tried to emphasize is a playground is not a playground is not a playground, right? So, we put pictures up of, okay, here's a playground in one park, here's a playground in the other park. These are not the same. And
Heidi.
And this is just, I think that's really important in the outreach that I do have this interesting position where I take feedback in from, like 1,000 different places. And the feedback that, you hear from some is really just interesting. And it kind of, to me, shows me what a responsibility I have working for the government to share information about, what is going on and how we can do that. I truly believe that once people see the pictures that we share, that can shift attitudes. towards creating a more equitable city. So yeah, Julie, I just wanted to share that map really quickly.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just recommend that everyone take a few moments, even while you're listening in, to click on that link from that Heidi put in the chat. And I mean, if you go and you click, let's say, for example, a park in Pacific Beach and Mission Valley, and scroll through those pictures and then try one in, Barrio or in Otay, and that comparison is staggering. I mean, it's pretty blatant. That's what a great tool, Heidi. Thank you.
And then, sorry, if I can just add one other thing too. When we talk about parks, and Heather talks about this, what park access means. There's so much that goes into park access, and it really just takes the coordination of so many different areas of expertise in order to make a park successful. So, one of the things we really focus on is programming and activity within the park spaces, but also accessing the park. And Julie, Boston Linear Park, to me, Barrio Logan, is just like this incredible example of what park access means. So it's not just about the park space, it's about the connections to this park space. If you go to this potential park site, which we want to see happen, there's residential units right across the street from it. A lot of people live there. It would serve the most people. The location is incredible, but there's a freeway on-ramp, and it's really dangerous to access that park, from a pedestrian safety level. And so also just looking at access in terms of, how to access it. And another thing that I've seen happen over the years is not wanting to invest in parks because the maintenance can be more costly, or because it's not currently safe in those parks. And, to me, it's like, okay, if it's not safe in the park, and if the maintenance, is more burdensome, that means that we need even more investments in those parks. But we didn't have policies in place that said that before. And so, we do now. I am optimistic that over the rest of our careers, that we will continue to improve on those, and just continue to share information. So just everybody that's joining here, thank you for being here. And I think the more people that we can spread kind of the word to, the more that we can address, everything that has just gone so terribly wrong over the past several decades.
Awesome, and thank you for that. And I promised that this would be a rich conversation. I love the direction that the conversation has really taken off in addressing some of the root causes again of inequities, kind of bringing it to the purpose of this of the Leaders for Outdoor Equity. So often work in the space of equity address kind of the tip of the iceberg. All right, what do we need to do now, or what are some of the surface level or even superficial things that we can do to address equity within our community? But that can't really happen, or effective equity work can't happen without a deep understanding of the root causes, the intractable causes that have direct ties to where we are today, such as redlining, such as the fee structure and so forth. So thanks for diving into that and just giving us a deeper understanding there. Leslie, you brought up a little bit, or you touched on the work of the Trace Creek Coalition in developing out a robust set of community engagement standards. And I think, so much of equity work really depends on a diverse constituency informing what our parks look like, what our outdoor spaces look like, how we address environmental justice issues. At Outdoor Outreach, we work to not only connect youth to the outdoors through outdoor recreation, but also to help amplify their voice in that civic engagement process, to make sure that they feel empowered and they feel like their voice is being heard in those spaces. From a broader perspective, how's the Trace Creek Coalition working to engage a more diverse, broader constituency in that process?
Thanks for that, Les. So as I mentioned, the city's historic outreach to communities has been pretty broad, non-specific, and really not addressing the specific considerations of a given community, such that if you're going to survey a community in Encanto, you might be talking about heat islands. If you're going to talk to Southcrest, you might be wanting to talk about flooding. And so what we're working on is looking at neighborhood scale existing conditions and organizing community voices and youth leaders around those specific issues, and then figuring out the best ways to communicate those voices to City Hall. And so City Hall, for example, sent out over the last 6 or 8 months, 7 different surveys, or maybe 6, from 6 different departments, wanting to know how our communities felt about X, Y, and Z. So that does not, in and of itself, then create a robust dialogue between neighborhood scale voices and issues and the city of San Diego. So we're just right at the sort of beginning of starting a conversation with city leaders to figure out how we can work together to make sure that we are specifically reflecting the on the ground issues with communities. So for example, if we're talking about climate change, and I just put our website in the chat, you can see specifically where heat islands are and where flooding is and where redlining is and so on. So we need to move our conversation away from climate mitigation into what are we doing for the flooding at Beta Street and South Crest. Yeah. So I fear that sometimes when we stay very much at the macro level and the policy level, we're sort of really missing the point that these people need help. And Heidi's coming out to see this on, I think, Wednesday. But I mean, the community has been advocating for a Green Street in South Crest since 2011. And I sent the group that's coming out from the mayor's staff and the city, the document that shows the city's been telling the community since 2011 there'd be some flood control or mitigation down there. So here we are. So I guess, Les, in answer to your question, we just have to come up with neighborhood scale communication strategies that really work for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that community-based organizations can really fill that hole. I feel like that's what EHC does a lot. We, we go, again, these spaces aren't created for Black and brown folks. They can be intimidating. These are spaces that they're not accustomed to. And so it's really kind of breaking down that barrier and making, so what we do, we go out and we meet with community members in all the areas that we work with. We develop those relationships. We build what are called CATs, community action teams. And we meet with them on a monthly basis. And we go into their neighborhood, my neighborhood where I live as well. And we go to community spaces, community meeting rooms, libraries, somebody's apartments, their community room. And we talk about these issues. We say, hey guys, there's this plan coming through the city that says where our parks are gonna go and how we're gonna build them and which parks are important. And we break it down. And we get to the point where, we break it down to them with patience and they go, all right, I get that. I want this, I want this, I want that. Great. So let's practice how you do that in these spaces. Like we're all gonna go to the city council meeting. This is the link. Who needs access? Do we need to get you a tablet? Can we get 4 folks together to call in? Do you need a number? I mean, there's been times in the city where like we can't, our folks can't make these 3 o'clock meetings. We need a phone number, right? And so the city does what they have to do and give us a phone number for folks to call in, and we do testimony prep, right? We help them prepare their testimony. Like let's talk problem, action, solution, and then like this skill building to break down these barriers for folks to have the confidence to say, okay, I want to be there, and to understand what's happening. Because sometimes, like even for me, it can be so jargony sometimes, right? And like, I won't say any names, but I remember talking about a specific planning document with one person, and they said, oh, Julie, there's like the 4 of us that care, the 4 of us that are wonky that care about this. And I said, that's not right. There's so many people that care. And there's so many people that don't understand that they need to care, because we're having the conversations in these places at these times in this language, right? And so I think that CBOs really help to break down those barriers. And I really applaud Heidi for reaching out to those during this process, and for Leslie to trying to build that into our recommendations for the city engaging with the community. But I don't think that those can be really, you can't value them enough. Like you need to give folks people in places where they're really comfortable and come at them in their safe spaces. So.
And Les, could I just add one other thing? I know we're running out of time, but when I'm thinking about community voice, we also work, as many of the people on the call do, and you all, with schools. And the notion of outdoor equity and children is really an important one, because both Myrian and Heather talked about cultural inclusion and lack of familiarity with outdoor activities and so on. And so one of the things we notice in our families is that they don't always have time to take their kids anywhere on the weekends or after school. They're working, they're busy. And so one of the things they ask for is the integration into school-based activities of outdoor opportunities, so that the kids are not dependent on a parent on the weekend or an NGO or anybody else to take them, but they're getting that kind of exposure as a part of their NGSS or science learning or social emotional learning or whatever it happens to be that we're targeting. And so we really have to figure out how to integrate outdoor experiences and learning into the in-school sort of curriculum and culture, because we can't always count on extracurricular time. It doesn't always work for our families. So it's just a really important point about how we work with kids.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Leslie and Julie and Heidi. And Heidi, I think this next question is kind of in response to this discussion around community engagement strategies, and also thinking again about the audience that we have on this call that are made up of agency representatives that are looking to promote equity, and that are, that want to better hear from the communities that they represent, but are looking for those strategies to not only listen to hear from community, but to meaningfully integrate what the community is asking for in their respective planning processes. What are some of the key kind of takeaways from this conversation or strategies that city planning is putting into place in order to be able to hear and to integrate community feedback?
Yeah, we love working with community-based organizations, because we simply don't have the resources within our city organization to be able to make the daily one-on-one meaningful connections within each of the communities, right? So within the city of San Diego, we have over 50 different communities, and we just cannot get to know every single person with each of the communities. But what we can do is get to know the leaders of our community-based organizations that do have those relationships with the community, also that are able to kind of translate and be an ambassador of sorts of the information that the city is working on. So especially in the planning department, again, I said, I just love this example of simple but wrong and complex but right. And, oftentimes, it's frustrating. I mean, it's just so frustrating, for members of our community to understand, what the heck we're doing. And when there's, decades of racism and, ill will towards the community, it's hard to build that trust, that this complex thing is the right thing to do. It's such an incredibly valuable resource to be able to work with our organizations in the community, to be able to not only help us get input, feedback, but also to help, to inform and educate as well. And, in terms of, why this is so important, we don't want to put in any kind of investments into a community that won't be valued, loved, enjoyed by those communities. That's just from a government spending perspective, just an irresponsible use of government funds. And so, one example that I kind of give a lot is, we want to achieve our climate goals, right? So so this is a great group. Parks are I love parks, right? But, I also, deal with climate and, all kinds of other issues as well. So a lot of the climate, okay, we want to put, we put more housing and jobs near transit because we want to achieve our climate goals. Well, here's the deal, right? You can put all the density you want near transit. You can put all the infrastructure near transit. You can put walking lanes, biking lanes, you can put the coolest park spaces in the world. But if it's super unsafe and it's gross and dirty, nobody is going to use those bike lanes. Nobody's going to walk outside freely at night. women especially are not going to walk freely around at night, under that societal condition. And so the investments are useless unless we address so many other factors. And so the same thing goes for parks. If we invest, our resources in parks that won't be used by the community, won't be, valued by the community, it's just not a good, we want to use our funds. We want to use our limited resources in a way that brings the most positive change to people's lives. And we can't do that when we don't know what they want. One of the things that I will say is the traditional way that governments very traditionally have gotten input from the communities. They hold a community meeting that like normal people can't really attend. And so the feedback that we get is touted as being what the community wants. And I always kind of challenge people to really think about what the community is when we say this is the community wants, because who really is the community? And so like the example that I give my staff, especially our newer staff, is, if you got to the community and the community tells you that they would like you to redline your community, are you really going to redline the community because the community wanted that? We kind of have to balance a lot of things here. One is we kind of have to balance community input with what's the right thing to do. And then also balance that with, not being, the saviors and getting the input from the real community. So what I always say is we need to have input from the community, and the community is actually the community that participates needs to actually be truly representative of the population. And I can tell you, we have data that shows that it's not, but then also just like data aside, all the complicated stuff aside, we just know that it's not true. When we have community input that says the park system is fine the way it is, okay, that's a voice within the community that believes that, and but that's not representative. If you truly were able to access everybody in the communities, I don't think the community input would be that. And so just kind of going back to, working with our partners, it's just wonderful that we have people within the community that are able to make those connections. And I look forward to continuing to work with all of them. And, thank you for being the go-between to translate all of our complicated nonsense.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Wanted to take some questions from the chat. So I'm seeing a question by Christine Duggan, who asks, how do we balance making spaces like parks and canyons cleaner and safer while not further displacing or criminalizing those without homes occupying the space? And this question's to the whole panel, but I think it also touches on a conversation that we were having where Julie, we were talking about the concept of safety as well in park spaces. So I'll pose that question to the whole panel. Anyone can hop in first.
Yeah, I'd love to touch on that because we were talking about it. I think that it's so funny where I live, we have a lot of shelterless community members, and they do have a presence at the park. And I'm lucky to live in a space where we have a very self-determined community. So we do a lot of our own policing. We have the Brown Berets, and we have folks that kind of, and we bring those folks into the community. We know their names and things like that. So I think that helps with the safety issue, but I think it talks about, the intersectionality of these problems, right? Like we can talk about park safety all day, but until we invest in mental health, until we invest in housing for shelterless people, the supportive housing, right, for folks, we're going to have that problem everywhere. And it's not going to go away. And I want to say that in urban and it's tied to policing, right? Because police shuffle folks from more desirable areas, right, into urban cores and centers that have been historically divested. So it's all this intersectional and unfortunately bias and racist rooted ways that systems work, right? So I think that while we're investing in parks, we also have to raise our voices to fund housing for all, to fund mental health for all, right? And so we're in this fight, but we're in so many fights for equity and equality. So,
and following up on what Julie says, while we're advocating for housing and support for our unsheltered population, we also can increase levels of service for those parks that are most adversely impacted. So it's not a sequential issue. It's as Julie said, an intersectional issue. So we've got to do something. Also, we can't claim that our communities have access to parks when they can't use their parks.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly, touch back on something I think I said earlier of it's not like it's not a simple solution. It's not like you can, try one strategy and solve that problem. It really takes a coordinated effort to address so many societal issues. You can, engage the community all you want, put exactly the type of park they want, but if you don't address, mental health issues, food access, just so many different factors within the community, it's not, it won't be a successful space. It's not as simple. There's nothing with changing the world that is a single discipline.
Awesome, thank you all. And feel free to the audience as well to continue to add questions to the chat box to keep this conversation going. One question that I had, kind of a follow-up question, and that we were discussing a little bit as we were planning for this conversation. In the last two sessions, we specifically and intentionally engaged Native American speakers to share their insights and perspectives on equity, access, and public lands. And so my question here is, where do Native American or where does Native American land repossession fit into urban park policy and management? So, for example, Richard Bugby on our last call shared the importance of Native and Indigenous land stewardship practices. California State Parks Director Armando Quintero shared some of the state's efforts to repossess land back to Indigenous communities. So reflecting on how that plays into urban park policy and city park policy as well is a question I wanted to pose to the panel, but maybe starting with you, Heidi.
Sure. I think again, this kind of goes back to also, working with partners in the community. I'll just give you an example. We're also working on a climate resiliency plan to adapt to climate change hazards, and we again, USD, thank you USD for all of the great forms that you provide to us. But with the Climate Collaborative, there's also a tribal working group. And so we've been able to present through that avenue. We also, in the planning department, do tribal consultations with the tribes on all of our planning initiatives that involve amendments to our general plan. So like the Parks Master Plan, for example, we were fortunate, to be able to meet. We actually even did it before the pandemic, so we, can do it in person. But then we continued, virtually after that, to be able to get feedback on how to not only accurately describe the background of the lands on which our parks will be placed, but also, have that really direct feedback on how we can shape our policies to preserve our tribal cultural resources as well.
And I would say, adding to that, again, trying to grow our Native American land stewards from the ground up. And so, for example, one of the things we do in the Earth Lab education program is partner with Kumeyaay Community College. So we're bringing in students from the college to work with our younger students on Indigenous environmental practices, understanding of our watershed's history, and so on. So I think part of it is growing these young people up to be the advocates for just what you're saying, Les and Heidi.
Yeah, and thinking about it politically, I think really encouraging our natives to run for office and hold public spaces. The Biden administration with Secretary Deb Halland. That's like a, I think we should be doing that at the city level. We should be supporting them to do things like boarding commissions and being a resource to natives in the city at all levels. So and allowing them to self-determine. I mean, and even on like the micro level, like I know we have some urbanized natives here in Barrio Logan. We have a big connection to the Kumeyaay, and there's lots of folks from other tribes living within the community. And, we let them lead when it comes to like our community gardens on national and different spaces, letting them take ownership and leadership and bring their knowledge to even these like micro spaces. So from micro to macro, just supporting them.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. So as we're coming to the close of our time here, I just want to again say thank you all for just leaning into a really robust conversation, a conversation with an appropriate amount of tension and challenge that should still exist as well as we're moving this work forward. And so in the spirit of kind of an activity that Dr. Zachary Green led for our Leaders for Outdoor Equity leadership cohort, just wanted to maybe in the last few minutes do kind of a one breath exercise. If you would take a deep breath in, and then in one breath share with us just kind of maybe a final thought or where you see the future of this work. So feel free to take a pause. This wasn't a pre-planned question, but just kind of in one breath sharing a final thought or the future of this work, or maybe some inspiration that you would give to those that are on this discussion.
Future of the work. So
Julie first.
Sure, I'll go for it. So breath and then whatever comes out.
Exactly.
I hope to see a future generation lead us to a green and safe and vibrant San Diego.
Thank you for that. Heidi, I saw you're unmuted.
Okay, I would say I hope that everybody maintains a lot of energy to continue to do things that may be perceived as difficult.
Excellent, thank you. Leslie?
I dream of the Choyes Creek watershed being one of the top regional destinations for any visitor or anybody else living in our region.
Excellent, thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi, Julie, Leslie, for your remarkable insights. And now that we've heard from all of our speakers, please, again, I invite the audience to take a moment to digest what you've just heard, what you've learned, and apply this also, apply the information, strategies, the techniques that you've heard from this conversation in your work. And so now in the next few minutes for the leadership cohort of the Leaders for Outdoor Equity, we'll be transitioning over to the link that is in your, that you've received, the calendar invite that you've received for the second part of this session, where we'll dive into a leadership application with Dr. Zachary Green. We'll go ahead and give a 7 to 8 minute break, and we'll join on to that call at 11:05. Thank you all again for joining. Thank you again to all of our phenomenal panelists, and we look forward to seeing you at our next module next month.